You know that feeling when your car makes a weird noise and your first thought isn't, I should get that checked, but please God, not now. I cannot afford this right now. Or when you're lying in bed at night, scrolling through your bank account app for the third time that week, doing mental math about whether you could survive if anything went wrong. That moment when someone casually mentions they got laid off and your entire body tenses because you realize you'd be completely screwed if that happened to you. Yeah, that feeling. That very specific flavor of financial anxiety that sits in your chest like a weight you've learned to carry but never quite gotten used to. My name is Emmy, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, why people make the financial decisions they do, and specifically, why something as simple and universally recommended as an emergency fund somehow feels impossible for most people to actually build. And here's what's wild. After years of watching people struggle with this, talking to financial advisors, reading countless studies on savings behavior, and honestly examining my own complicated relationship with emergency savings, I've realized that most of the advice out there is technically correct, but practically useless. It's like telling someone drowning to just swim. Not wrong, but not particularly helpful either. Because here's the thing nobody wants to admit. The traditional emergency fund advice, save 3 to 6 months of expenses, keep it liquid, don't touch it unless it's a real emergency, that advice was designed for a financial reality that doesn't exist for most people anymore. It assumes you have extra money to save. It assumes your income is stable. It assumes you're already behind. And it definitely assumes you have the psychological bandwidth to delay gratification for a theoretical future emergency while dealing with very real present-day financial stress. But what if I told you there's a completely different way to think about emergency funds? Not the sanitized, one-size-fits-all approach you see in every personal finance article, but something more nuanced, more realistic, and honestly, way more effective for actual human beings with complicated lives and imperfect circumstances. Something that acknowledges where you actually are, not where some finance guru thinks you should be. That's what we're going to talk about. And I promise you, by the end of this, you're going to understand not just how to build an emergency fund, but why the version you've been trying to build might be the exact wrong one for your life. The myth of the perfect emergency fund. So let's start with the uncomfortable truth. The traditional emergency fund advice is, kind of classist. I know that sounds harsh, but hear me out. When financial experts tell you to save 6 months of expenses before you do anything else, before you pay off debt, before you invest, before you even think about other financial goals, they're operating from a place of privilege they don't even recognize. They're assuming you have enough income not just to cover your expenses, but to have surplus income every month. They're assuming you're not living paycheck to paycheck. They're assuming you don't have to choose between building savings and, buying groceries. The data on this is actually pretty depressing. Studies show that roughly 40% of Americans couldn't cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing money or selling something. 40%. But the financial advice industrial complex keeps churning out the same save 6 months of expenses line like it's helpful, like it's achievable, like people aren't saving because they just haven't tried hard enough. And here's where it gets psychologically damaging. When you're told over and over that you need this massive emergency fund and you can't build it because your financial reality doesn't allow for it, you start to internalize that as personal failure. You start thinking you're bad with money. You start feeling hopeless. And ironically, that hopelessness often leads to worse financial decisions because if you can't do it right, why try at all? I see this all the time. Someone making $35,000 a year, struggling with student loans and rent and just basic survival, reading advice written for someone making $150,000 and feeling like a failure because they can't save $20,000 for emergencies. It's absurd. It's counterproductive. And it's completely missing the point of what an emergency fund actually is. Because here's what an emergency fund really is. It's a buffer between you and catastrophe. That's it. It's not a moral virtue, it's not a measure of your worth as a person, it's a practical tool designed to prevent small problems from becoming life-destroying problems. And the specific amount you need for that buffer, that's wildly variable based on your actual life, your actual risks, and your actual circumstances. The tiered emergency fund approach. Okay, so if the traditional advice doesn't work, what does? This is where we need to completely reframe how we think about emergency funds. Instead of one massive, intimidating goal, think of your emergency fund as having different tiers, each one serving a specific purpose, each one achievable, and each one immediately useful. Tier 1, the immediate crisis fund, $500 to $1,000. This is your the car broke down and I need to get to work money. Your the medical copay is $300 money. Your my phone died and I literally cannot function in modern society without it money. And I cannot stress this enough. This first tier is exponentially more valuable than having nothing. There's this weird tendency in personal finance to dismiss small amounts of savings as not worth it. But that's completely backwards. The difference between having $0 and having $500 in terms of financial stability and psychological well-being is absolutely massive. The difference between having $500 and $5,000? Still significant, but nowhere near life-changing. Because here's what that $500 to $1,000 does. It breaks the debt cycle. Without it, a $400 emergency becomes a payday loan or a credit card you can't pay off, which becomes interest, which becomes a bigger problem, which becomes stress, which becomes poor decisions, which becomes a worse financial situation. With it, a $400 emergency is an annoying $400 expense. Still sucks, but it doesn't compound into something worse. Tier 2, the job loss buffer, 1 to 2 months of absolute bare bones expenses. And notice I said bare bones expenses, not your regular expenses. This is rent, utilities, minimum debt payments, basic food. This isn't your Netflix subscription or your regular restaurant budget or any of the lifestyle things you could cut if you absolutely had to. Why 1 to 2 months instead of the traditional 3 to 6 months? Because most people, if they lose their job, aren't going to sit around with zero income for months. They're going to get unemployment benefits, pick up gig work, borrow from family, find some kind of income. This tier isn't about replacing your entire income for 6 months. It's about giving you breathing room to figure things out without immediately losing your apartment or having your utilities shut off. And psychologically, 1 to 2 months feels achievable in a way that 6 months doesn't. You can actually see yourself getting there, which means you're more likely to stick with it. Tier 3, the full stability fund. 3 to 6 months of regular expenses. This is the traditional emergency fund goal, but notice it's tier 3, not tier 1. You only worry about this after you've built the more immediately useful tiers. And honestly, not everyone needs this tier. If you have a stable job, good disability insurance, and low fixed expenses, you might be fine with tier 2. If you're self-employed with wildly variable income, or if you're working in a volatile industry, or if you have dependents relying on your income, then yeah, tier 3 becomes really important. But it's not a moral imperative. It's a personal calculation based on your actual risk profile and your actual circumstances. The location strategy. Where should this money actually live? All right, so you're building your emergency fund in tiers, but where does the money actually go? And this is where traditional advice gets weirdly dogmatic and frankly outdated. The standard advice is to keep your emergency fund in a regular savings account, high-yield savings account if you're fancy, the logic being that it needs to be liquid, immediately accessible, and safe, not invested in the stock market where it could lose value right when you need it. And look, that's not wrong, but it's incomplete. Because here's what nobody talks about. Having your emergency fund in a regular savings account earning essentially nothing, while you're simultaneously carrying credit card debt at 22% interest, is literally losing money every single day to make sure your emergency fund is safe. So here's a more nuanced approach. For tier 1, $500 to $1,000, yeah, regular savings account. You need this money to be absolutely instantly accessible. No exceptions, no complications. This is your grab it on my phone while sitting in the mechanic's waiting room money. For Tier 2, 1 to 2 months of expenses, this is where it gets interesting. If you have high interest debt, and I'm talking anything over 10%, you might actually be better off paying that down aggressively while keeping Tier 1 intact and treating the available credit on your card as Tier 2. I know that's going to make some financial advisors lose their minds, but hear me out. If you have a credit card with a $5,000 limit and no balance, that is functionally $5,000 of emergency funds. Is it ideal? No. Is it better than having $5,000 sitting in a savings account earning 1% interest while you pay 22% interest on a different card? Mathematically, absolutely. The key is that you have to be disciplined about paying off any emergency charges immediately once the crisis passes, and you need that Tier 1 buffer so you're not putting everything on credit. For Tier 3, 3 to 6 months, once you're at this level and you've killed your high-interest debt, you can start getting a bit more sophisticated. A portion in a high-yield savings account for true liquidity, maybe a portion in something like I-bonds, government savings bonds that you can't touch for 12 months but earn decent interest after that, or even conservative investments if you have a Tier 1 and Tier 2 buffer